So let's welcome Bill.
Thank you. Thank you. If you've been around San Diego as long as I have, you've seen the neighborhood change a little bit. Okay, well, part of what I'm going to be doing tonight is a little trip down memory lane, because if you knew downtown, the Gaslamp area, before 1985 when Horton Plaza opened, you knew what a rundown, seedy, crummy pit it had become. And to see how it's changed in the last 40 years is really kind of amazing. You know, and tonight we'll be looking at how some of those changes occurred, a lot of it from personal experience. And in describing what happened, I remember our business on 4th Avenue, we were open late for quite a few years, as late as 11 o'clock for a retail store. I mean, we weren't a restaurant or bar, but a store, we were open till late on Friday and Saturday nights to try to get a little extra business when things weren't going that well. And I remember closing the store one night and heading up past Croce's restaurant, up F Street, and turning up E Street. The neighborhood was buzzing, and there were 3 young women walking ahead of me. They were just chatting they were excited. They'd obviously been out kind of drinking and partying. And as I was walking past them, one said, "I don't know, it's so un-Orange County." Described it, which I thought was an amazing description. You know, how do you describe what it is that happened here? And having gotten involved with some of the civics group in town and hanging out with architects and urban planners in the process, I became aware of this famous book by Jane Jacobs. Are you familiar with this book and her ideas? She was. The book was written in 1961, and she was primarily talking about New York and Toronto. But she was concerned that some great neighborhoods that were very lively and fun to live in were being torn down. Barry, you probably know this story. And they were putting up sort of high-rise urban renewal projects. And she fought that. She fought Robert Moses in New York and is famous for fighting back and helping to save some of the lively, cool neighborhoods. And went on to write a book about it. And she called what she liked in a city exuberant diversity. And I kind of came to realize, well, you know, as a traveler myself, that's what I look for when I travel. I want to find those neighborhoods. Where are those cool neighborhoods? A lot of restaurants, people on the street, people having fun. And the book she wrote described the 4 conditions required to create exuberant diversity in a city or a district. And it struck me that the Gaslamp Quarter is really a textbook case of what she was talking about. She says, the district must serve more than one primary function, preferably more than 2. They must ensure the presence of people going outdoors on different schedules and be in the place for different purposes, but who are able to use many of the facilities in common. If you had a restaurant in the Gaslamp, for example, part of your business would be coming from the business district to the north. Some of it would be coming from the people who are here that live in the neighborhood. A lot of it would be coming from people that are here for conventions and staying in the hotels nearby. Some of it would be coming now from the Padres ballpark. Those are different primary uses in the neighborhood that have fed people into the neighborhood and helped create that exuberant diversity. Second one is blocks must be short and opportunity to turn corners. That is typical of San Diego. We have blocks that are 200 feet east-west, 300 feet north-south. The district must mingle buildings that vary in age and conditions, including a good proportion of ones so they vary in economic yield and they must produce. And the mingling must be fairly close-grained. That's characteristic of the Gaslamp. I mean, the good thing about the Gaslamp is it's 16 and a half blocks. That's a whole lot of buildings and a lot of ground floor storefronts, a lot of real estate in different conditions. And the history of the Gaslamp is that block by block, building by building, somebody came in, repurposed that space, put a business in there, brought customers in. And in fact, it's particularly true of Joan and I, who I'll get into it later, but we were able to buy a building on 4th Avenue that it's kind of silly that a bank would loan us money when they did, but the building was fairly cheap. We put our business in there. And then there must be a sufficient concentration of people for whatever reason they may be there. So, you know, I think the Gaslamp really does show us this exuberant diversity has emerged. And if you were here before Horton Plaza opened and you go to Yelp now and look, these are restaurants in the vicinity of the Gaslamp today. I mean, my goodness, if you knew the neighborhood back then, you can't believe that we've gotten to this now. So the question is how it happened. And there's a lot of ways of talking about it. We've had some other history talks, including the great historic architect Wayne Donaldson, who worked on a lot of buildings, including this one we're in. The Horton Grand Hotel was a project he worked on as an architect. We had the developer of this hotel, Dan Pearson, come tell the story about this hotel. And again, those videos are on the Gaslamp Historical Foundation website. So you can look at the story of the Gaslamp in that way. You can look at it from the city. One of the next speakers is going to be Mike Stepner, who was the city architect, and will tell the story of how the city began to engage redevelopment. Tonight, our experience was being a street-level business on 4th Avenue. And that's really the way I'm going to look at it. We were a travel business, and so I kind of came to our business in the Gaslamp with the eyes of a traveler, looking at different communities, loving history, loving transportation systems. I think that's a big part of how you understand any neighborhood, but the Gaslamp is typical of that. We were a retailer, a retail store, and so we had to deal with all the ups and downs and vicissitudes, changes in shopping patterns, talking a little bit about that. And then I got involved in some of the civic affairs, so I'll also talk about engagement in the Gaslamp Quarter Association, the Downtown Community Planning Group. But first, let me go to a little personal side of this story. I met a young lady in a French class at Grossmont College in 1973, and Madame Ermenkoff's French class, and said, "You want to go to South America?" And she said, "Sure, let's do that." So we took off. We didn't get all the way to South America. We traveled by train out of Mexicali. We traveled by bus throughout most of Mexico. We hitchhiked from Mazatlan to Tepic. We caught a bus down to Puerto Vallarta. We were standing around the little plaza in downtown Puerto Vallarta one night. And this man and his son chatted us up and said, "Hey, why don't you come on over to dinner?" And that's what I live for. A moment like that is what I love. And I love that I found somebody else in my life who loves that too. And so we traveled for 2 months, got to Guatemala, and made our way back in summer of 1973. And next, we always call this the hippies return from Guatemala picture. But long story short, I ended up at UCSD studying modern Chinese history. Joan was at San Diego State. She was running the teller training program at Home Federal Savings and Loan just up the street through the mid-'70s. I was doing tours of downtown San Diego in the summertime. But we went on for the next 40 years, built a business, raised a family, including the young man behind the camera back there, and just had an amazing life, a lot of that being in the Gaslamp Quarter. We had bought the historic Labor Temple building on 4th Avenue in 1994. I'll talk about that a little bit, but just to give you an idea of who we were a store for travelers. We had lots of travel accessories, money belts, voltage converters, everything you need for a big international trip, luggage, travel books and maps in the back there, travel clothing, but the idea was a one-stop store for world travelers. And in fact, I was pleased to hear that Rhiannon's folks came and bought stuff from us before going off to Russia. She lived in Russia for a year. I know the folks in the back go to Tahiti often, and we had dinner in Paris with them one time. So we were kind of the go-to place for that type of trip. And let's jump back in time just to kind of get an idea of the buildings, the layout of downtown San Diego. How did that come to be? And it goes back, I think a lot of you know this story, but it goes back to you had the Franciscan missions come up here, Junipero Serra, 1769, I think it was. And Mexico took over in whatever that was, 1810. The Mexican-American War was 1846 to 1848. The United States grabbed California in 1848. Gold rush starts in 1849. California becomes a state in 1850. In 1850, William Heath Davis came down to San Diego, saw that the town was up where we now, what we call Old Town, and Heath was the first one to say, we should have a city down by the bay. The bay is the right place for this. And he came up and bought this parcel of land, which is basically between First Avenue over to where Seaport Village is now. I think it was 160 acres that he bought. And this is, City Park is Balboa Park, just to give you a kind of a sense of that. So he tried to develop a new town in that area, but he was basically too early. It was really hard to get to San Diego in that era. Most people who came here came by ship from the East Coast down to the Panama, walked across the isthmus, caught another boat up to San Diego. That was easier than going overland by stagecoach or in a wagon train or something like that. So he was too early. His first settlement really didn't work. And the storm clouds were brewing. I mean, here he's trying to create this in the 1850s, and what happens in 1861, the Civil War. I mean, things get totally out of control, 1861 to 65. And, but the interesting thing is, during the Civil War, during the Lincoln administration, the Transcontinental Railway was being built. It was under construction even as the war was going on. And the guy who came out was Alonzo Horton, who came in 1867, a couple of years after the Civil War, had the same idea as William Heath Davis and said, let's build a city down by the bay. Now his timing was better because the railroads were on their way, and he bought up all of the land that you see here. In fact, that earlier photograph was just a close-up of this area. So here's, these are two separate maps. That's San Diego Bay. There's where Seaport Village would be, Balboa Park. And this is what Alonzo Horton bought up, which is that. And it was from Front Street to 15th, down to the bay, up to A Street, and then it went all the way up into what's now Bankers Hill. So he bought this very cheap and began to lay out the city and tried to sell lots. And it was, it took a while for that really to get going. But what he did was he built a wharf down at the end of Fifth Avenue. And this is a photo probably from, I would say, 1870s or 80s. But it was interesting that, you look out here and you have both sailboats and steamships. So you're, for transportation system, this is the era when you're going from sail to steam in the case of ships. And you've got rails. I'm not even sure if at this era these were being pulled by a steam engine or by horses. But look what they're bringing in. What they're bringing in on those boats is lumber. And this is, as the city of San Diego is beginning to grow, what gets built? Lower Fifth Avenue, right here, looked like an old cowboy town. It was wooden, one-story. You could have done a better job, John. You would have thrived in this era. But it's all wood, dirt streets, kind of boardwalks. It looks like a cow town. And most of that is gone now. But that kind of, if you continued up Fifth Avenue, Fourth Avenue, this is, Alonzo Horton built the Horton House, the hotel, which is where the U.S. Grant now stands. That replaced it back in 1907. And this was Horton Plaza. And again, look at it. It's the era of horses, buggies, horses and buggies. In fact, one of the things I read was that the year 1900 was the year of peak horse. That was, article said that there were 3 million horses in the United States at that time, and they were still the transportation system. We were in transition, railroads were coming in, but it was the transportation systems were in transition. What happened in this neighborhood, now known as the Gaslamp, the north end of the Gaslamp really took off in the build-up to 1885 when we finally were going to have a rail line coming down to San Diego. It was a spur line to the Atchison, Topeka, Santa Fe. And the buildings many of the buildings that you still have in the Gaslamp are buildings that were built in that era in anticipation of the railroads coming or shortly thereafter. The buildings made out of stone and brick are still there. The old wooden buildings, for the most part, are gone. There was once upon a time a great business down in that corner there. The other big burst of activity was in preparation for the opening of the Panama Canal, which was in 1915. And of course, that was the California-Panama Exposition in Balboa Park. Was a big deal. Panama Canal opens. You can now get here by train or by ship. But a lot of the buildings up in the north end of the Gaslamp that still survive are from that era. And this is really kind of what has been preserved in the Gaslamp in becoming an historic district. What we have is the fabric of an old rail town. This is like so many other cities built along the rail lines in that era. You go to Durango, Colorado, Flagstaff, Arizona, Gallup, New Mexico, a lot of places around the western US, and you'll see very similar architecture, very similar building style. Most of them are not thriving the way this district is. And again, that's what the point of tonight is. Exuberant diversity happened here. It's amazing. But we also have preserved a really good example of a western rail town from the period about 1880 to about 1920 or thereabouts. In fact, in 1880, the population of San Diego was 2,600 people. I mean, we're a young city. By 1910, that got up to 39,000, 1920, 74,000. So again, the era that the Gaslamp preserves, we went from 2,600 to 74,000, and we're 1.2 million now. So, But in addition to Alonzo Horton, the guy that kind of came after him that was a big influence on San Diego was John D. Spreckels of the famous Spreckels sugar family. And he saw a big opportunity down here. Obviously, the Spreckels building up on Broadway, the old Bank of America building at 6th and Broadway. He built a lot of stuff, including the Spreckels Organ Pavilion. I think he donated the money for that up in Balboa Park. But he was a big transportation guy, and he founded the San Diego Electric Railway in 1892. And one of the things I read, I'm not sure it's true, but I read that that was the first electric railway, electric streetcar system in the United States. Pretty cool. But he also built the San Diego, Arizona Railway, which is the right-of-way, and much of the track is still there. There are efforts to get that open again. You know, that's a rail that goes out of South Bay, dips into Mexico, comes up out of Campo. That was an effort to create a direct link between San Diego and the rail systems out east. So the point of this so far is that the historic district that we have is the Gaslamp Quarter. It's on the register, National Register of Historic Places. The Gaslamp Quarter is on the National Register, and it's based on 92 buildings that we have from that era, from 1880 to 1920. Now, I'm going to jump forward and kind of skip over World War I and World War II, because really not that much happened in the Gaslamp per se. What we're going to kind of go to next is looking at what this area was and how it was actually thriving in the 50s. It declined into the 60s and really got really run down, and then it's come exploding back. So kind of going back to 1946 shot here, it's taken up over, this would be Seaport Village down here, and you have the Coronado Ferry landing, you have the old police station, and I don't even want to tell you about the time I got taken in there in handcuffs. It was really bullshit. I really thought it wasn't fair. It really wasn't. It was dumb.
I know the story.
You also have, let's see, I think that's probably the Spreckels building there, Grant Hotel over here. And when you look out this way, you know, the whole East Village area and even the Gaslamp area over in here was kind of single story, and it was light industry, little warehouse buildings down near the end of Fifth Avenue. I especially remember these natural gas tanks that were part of the San Diego Gas and Electric footprint out there. They were there until the ballpark came in. The ballpark was basically built mostly on the San Diego Gas and Electric land out in East Village where these tanks stood. But you know, the concentration of buildings was up north of Broadway, and really not much was happening. Again, this is 1946, and this is very similar to what I remember growing up a kid here. I was born in San Francisco in 1950, but came here when I was 2 years old. Joan was born in Minnesota. She came here when she was 2 years old. So we both have a lot of recollection of this era, and it looked like that. That's what it was like in the 50s. I like this map that I stumbled on because it kind of makes that point even better. You can see the concentration of buildings were up north of Broadway. This thing doesn't even go out past 12th Avenue. You know, police station, Naval Supply Center, that's actually being torn down now. Actually, one thing I want to point out here is this is Navy Field. What's there now? Convention Center. It was 3 baseball diamonds. I mean, this was a small town with civic buildings and courthouses here. This is actually a map, I believe, from the early 1960s, because you actually show Interstate 5 coming through there, and that didn't open until the early 60s. It also shows Highway 395. If you've been around San Diego, you remember old 395. What surprised me is it actually shows 395 starting down at the foot of Market Street and coming up, and northbound going up 11th Avenue, southbound on 10th. That now Highway 163. But stretches of 395 used to run, and if you're going up to Mammoth, the backside of the Sierra, you're on 395. Well, what is now 163 feeds into 15, and you go up to the high desert and you turn off. 395 is what it was called, and it started down here. But at any rate, there wasn't a lot happening in downtown. As a kid here, there were a number of reasons one would come down here. My favorite was to go to jalopy races at Balboa Stadium. And for the folks who don't know, Balboa Stadium is still there. It's out behind San Diego High School. You go up Park Boulevard, just east of San Diego High School, north of City College. The track and some of the stands are still there. But in the 50s, I became a race car fan. I'm still a NASCAR fan. My folks used to come, we lived out in what's now known as Fairmont Park, just about 5 miles east. If you go out 94 and turn off on Home Avenue, up to the north of that is where we moved when I was 5 years old. And I remember coming downtown. We would come down to go to the jalopy races. And in 1961, of course, the Chargers moved into Balboa Stadium. This is a shot from a little bit later. And initially, it was a single-deck stadium. The Chargers put in a second deck. And this was the American Football League. This was not the NFL. This was this breakaway league. And with some stars like Paul Lowe, Keith Lincoln. They really had some great teams. But that was another reason you'd come down. I went to football games there. You'd come down and ride the Coronado Ferry. And you'd come down to shop. I wish I had better illustrations of this. I didn't have to go to the History Center and dig through the files and find some of these old shots. But you know, downtown San Diego was really kind of happening in the 50s and early 60s. You've got the Walker Scott was the famous department store. But you also had somebody who was talking about Lyons. That was just up the street. You had Harris and Frank, and they had Owl Drugstore. Marston's was up around the corner there. Thurl's Music was a great music store. You know, you used to shop in downtown San Diego. Now, it wasn't really down in the Gaslamp Quarter. It was mostly clustered up around 5th. And in fact, my father he was a junior attorney in Procopio, Price, Corey, and Schwartz, which was in the San Diego Trust and Savings Building. And we'll be talking a little bit about Saul Price later, but Ed Schwartz's name is on the Federal Building over here. Procopio is still the name up on the tower up north of Broadway. But I remember sitting on the 4th floor of that building in my dad's swivel chair looking out the window in the 50s. But again, San Diego downtown was actually not, it was kind of an interesting place. And now Lower Broadway was interesting in a somewhat different way. You had the Hotel San Diego up here. You were going up toward Horton Plaza there, streetcars running through here. The YMCA building and this great old bowling alley. That was just a kind of a cool landmark. And it's from there, it's 2 blocks down to the Santa Fe Depot. And one little aside on this is that when San Diego decided to build a convention center, this is where they were planning to put it. It was the 4 blocks from Broadway north 2 blocks over here. That was where San Diego almost built the convention center. It was a sort of an afterthought to move it down to Navy Field, which was a really big deal for the Gaslamp, that decision. But the thing in the 50s and 60s about Broadway was you had a lot of Navy sailors. When they left the ship to go on leave, they came off the ship in uniform and they changed into civilian clothes, usually at a locker club. Broadway was lined with locker clubs, so you'd see sailors in uniform walking up Broadway. They'd duck into the 7 Seas over here, and they'd come out. If you were a local, you still knew they were a sailor. The haircuts, they had a different haircut than most of us locals did. But they were the thing that kind of typified Lower Broadway. So that's kind of a snapshot of the 50s and 60s. And again, downtown really was kind of a happening place in those. But then in the 60s, it really began to change. The whole pattern of development changed. And it had everything to do with the automobile and cheap gas, interstate highways. The whole interstate highway system was an Eisenhower project. I think it started in 1957. And it was in the early 60s that Interstate 8 replaced old Highway 80 through Mission Valley, and Interstate 5 took over from Highway 101. And you began to have more and more people moving to the suburbs, further and further from the center of town. In fact, in 1962, my family moved to a house just west of San Diego State. And that's where I went to junior high and high school out in that mid-city area, Horace Mann and Crawford. And in fact, in this photograph, you still see the Mission Valley. I remember my mom used to take us shopping. We'd buy tomatoes and corn from the farmer, out there where the stadium now stands. Maybe we can go back to that. But 1961 was when Mission Valley Center was developed. It was developed by the May Company, May Centers, and they had their May Company store at one end and their Montgomery Ward at the other end. And this became where people went to buy stuff. I mean, that was the big change in retail, is you didn't used to go downtown, where you used to go downtown, now you started going to your local regional malls surrounded by parking. Everybody drives, parks, shops. And the pattern is that you have the anchor stores at either end of the mall that draw the customers in, and then the little stores, ultimately like us, in between. We were the inline store that fed off of the traffic that were generated by the shopping, by the major tenants. The center that I used to go to a lot was College Grove. Has anybody been to College Grove? You go to College Grove? There you go. Out 94, College Avenue, just basically this side of Lemon Grove. It's the same exit for Lemon Grove, so it's north of Highway 94. And back in that era, it was a cool shopping center. And Walker Scott, the downtown department store folks, built a store out there. They tried to move with the times and create a new business model. I used to buy clothes at the Toggery shop, and what was the other one? There was another store out there that I particularly liked. But, so that was, living where we did, that was where we would go to shop in that era. Just continuing with the shopping idea, who remembers FedMart? Not so much, a few. It was started by Saul Price, who was an attorney in that law firm that my dad was in. And in fact, he inherited a store down on Main Street in San Diego in 1954 and didn't know what to do with it and ended up putting a store in there. It was a discount department store, And you had to be a member, and in fact, it was just federal employees that were able to be members of FedMart in the beginning. That changed, everybody could get a membership. But he developed this idea, got it up to, I think, 44 stores by 1975. He sold the company to some German interests who drove it into the ground, so it's no longer around. But he was a pioneer in this sort of discount department store and the big box idea. The big box now often refers to more of a specialty store, where his was a general merchandise store with lots of departments. I did a stint as a bag boy one Christmas there in 1972, I think it was. And I got a kick out of another guy who had done a stint prior to me as a bag boy, was a guy named Jim Senegal. He had been a bag boy at FedMart. He stayed with the company, got to be the vice president of merchandising. And my sister worked for Jim Senegal. She was a jewelry buyer in the mid-'70s, working for Jim Senegal, who came through FedMart. In fact, Senegal ended up a little bit later. What Saul Price did was he started the Price Club after he got out of FedMart. So the Price Club was the next generation of discount department, general merchandise stores. Their first one was out in Rose Canyon. That got to be a pretty big thing. But this Jim Senegal guy that worked there as well went off and started Costco. So Costco directly flows from Saul Price, from the law firm in downtown San Diego, and the ideas that were being developed there. But that's the retail landscape changing. I mean, that's the challenge, I think, for any business. In our business, it was trying to figure out, oh my God, how do we change with the times? The 60s, whew, if you lived through that, you had some experiences. And in fact, I went to this show. This is a Reader article that's talking about the Janis Joplin show at this community concourse in, there it is, September 28th, 1968. Coming downtown, music was the main reason I would come downtown in the 1960s. I didn't make it to the big Beatles concert at Balboa Stadium in 1965. You're smiling, did you go? No. Okay. No, but I'd love to have done that. But I did see at the El Cortez Convention Center, you know where El Cortez is, across the street to the north, they had a convention center that was attached to the hotel. And I saw the Ike and Tina Turner review there. Woo! Good stuff. I think that might have even been when Jimi Hendrix was playing guitar for them. Actually, Junior Walker and the All-Stars were there as well. I also saw the community concourse of Buffalo Springfield, which I thought was my favorite band of that era. I just love those guys. And Janis Joplin. In fact, one of the other ones that people don't remember too much, up at, you know where the Smart Corner is, up where the trolley turns through the high-rise building is up there? There used to be a bowling alley in that building on the second floor. And for a while, that was converted into a music club. It was called Jazzville. And I went there one night. I was 16 years old. There were probably 800-900 people in the audience. I counted 16 white people in the crowd. And it was Marvin Gaye and Sam and Dave, except that Sam and Dave no-showed, so we just got to see Marvin Gaye. But the point is, there were these music venues around in downtown. I even saw my favorite San Francisco band, Quicksilver Messenger Service, at a roller rink. And it was over on First Avenue. I don't even know what happened to that. But so the music scene was pretty cool in San Diego in the 60s. There was even this little local group that played around town a lot, and a lot of people liked. You had Kenny Giampa on bass, and Jan Tonnesen on guitar, and Donnie Arnold on drums, Skinny Boland, the lead singer, and me on the sax. So I was a Crawford High School class of 68. It was a big class. We had 3,000 students at Crawford, 1,000 graduating. It was the year before Patrick Henry High School opened. So, that whole San Carlos area was just being developed in the mid-60s, and people were just beginning to move into that. And I think Patrick Henry opened in 1969. It was a heck of a time to turn 18, too. That was the year that Lyndon Johnson in March said he's not going to run for president again. April, Martin Luther King got killed. the California primary in that year, in June of 1968, became, with Johnson not in the race, it became a big deal. And of course, the big contest was between Bobby Kennedy and Eugene McCarthy. Eugene McCarthy spoke at Starlight Bowl in Balboa Park. Bobby Kennedy spoke at the Civic Center. I saw him speak during that campaign up there, and actually patted him on the back as he walked out. I saw which way he was going to exit, which made, in retrospect, I wish he had better security around him at times like that. But that was, that was the Vietnam War. The Tet Offensive was the beginning of that year. There were 16,592 Americans killed in Vietnam that year. And I was getting out of high school, and I was working at Modern Equipment and Furnishings up at 12th and F at the time, earning money to take off on a big trip. I ended up going to Vietnam last year for the first time. I didn't go there the first time around. I went there last year. But the 60s in San Diego doesn't get the publicity a lot of other cities get, but there were a lot of stuff happening, and it was, downtown was part of that. But in that era, the big things that are changing, in addition to shopping centers, is the rise of North County became such a huge thing. UCSD Revelle College opened in 1964, Muir College and Salk Institute in 1967, just a lot of the energy of San Diego, the employment, the residential development was moving north, moving away from downtown. I was a student there for 3 years studying modern Chinese history and running a travel office on campus. I created a student travel office. When I got done, it was still the Cultural Revolution in China. I couldn't go kind of work on some field related to China because China was totally closed up. So I opted for going into the travel business. And in fact, the thing I remember is that the land east of UCSD was just all sagebrush. I mean, there was no development out there. All that University City area was not developed. UTC opened in 1977. So the center of gravity is shifting north. And that causes problems for downtown. You did have the banks. You had Union Bank. This was the Home Fed building where Joan ran the teller training program. You had some of C. Arnholt Smith's, his Westgate Hotel over there. But this was the skyline in the early 70s, and it was falling on hard times. The Keating Building. In that era, just down from what later became a fabulous restaurant. This was typical of what you had in that, dirty Mingus playroom. And in fact, this one I particularly remember. This is where Analog is now, that was Fio's for a long time. In fact, this was this Charlie Pipitone on this building, I think, was it, right? You guys had offices in there upstairs, didn't you? And as I recall, maybe you know this story, my understanding was Charlie Pipitone owned the building in this era, in the mid-70s, and he had the liquor license for the Singapore Go-Go and China Doll. And that was the same liquor license that rolled into the liquor license for Fio's and now Analog, presumably. Oh, is that right? They were actually... I used to drive tours of San Diego, and I would come down through this neighborhood from time to time. It wasn't like a high point, but I would show people the Sailors Entertainment District. That's what it was. That was the kind of business that was being done down here. And then there was an effort to turn it around, and Sandy nodding her head. Tom Hom, who grew up in this neighborhood on 3rd Avenue. In fact, where was he? Where are we now? He was right over here, wasn't it? On 3rd Avenue, you had the Chinatown of San Diego. It was small scale by West Coast standards, but there was a Chinatown, and Tom Hom did a tour of this neighborhood a year ago, talking about life growing up here in the 1930s. He's in his 90s now, but he showed, he talked about what it used to be like. And back in the day, he was one of the driving forces that helped create the Gaslamp Quarter. He was the president of the Gaslamp Quarter Association in 1974, and was part of helping to convince the city council to get serious about renovating the area. Another person that's still around, Mike Stepner, he teaches at the New School of Architecture, and I believe is going to be here we're going to have him in August as history talks. Come to that one, that'll be really interesting, because from the city side, he was a key guy that helped helped create all of the framework for the gas lamp to happen. He's well, it's a fascinating story. I won't try to tell too much of it. But one of the things that he did when he was a sort of a young architect for the city, and when the decision was made to create a National Historic District down here, they had to figure out where to draw the lines. Barry wanted to know where those lines are drawn, and here is the original drawing of those lines. There was a talk about stretching it up north of Broadway and this way and that way. The lines that got drawn were from Broadway to Harbor Drive along 6th Avenue and 4th Avenue, with a little knockout there where the Royal Pie Bakery was between Island and Market Street. Now you can't see much from this, so I did a kind of a close-up of this, and this is the hand-drawn map from Mike Stepner, and 1980. This is who was doing business in this neighborhood. There's Lyons Clothing. That building is in the Gaslamp. What have you got? Long's Drugs. There's a music store, bar, men's clothing, Security Pacific Bank, where the auto place is. There is Western Clothing, jewelry, and there is San Diego Hardware in 1980. Across the street was Ratner Electric. You go a couple of blocks down. In fact, this is the building that we later acquired. It was a tavern and vacant in that era. I'm having a hard time seeing this one. This is one of the ones that I find interesting, where the Borders Book Building got built in 2002. That was Midas Muffler Shop. Volunteers of America Thrift Shop. That's what is now Tin Roof, but for many years was the cheese shop. At any rate, so there was parking, mufflers, but when you get down south, you really start to see. You had Krasny's Guns was still on the corner down here, and let's see if I can get it, because a whole bunch of things are listed as porno shop, amusement, porno shop. I can't quite see it from this angle. But that was kind of the main thing that you had down here. And when you went down 6th Avenue, the interesting thing was you had wholesale produce. The food distribution in San Diego, right up until probably 15 years ago, you just had one after another of produce distribution going down here, including this one, which is now Omnia, was the Stingaree for a long time. That was the Mellows Produce warehouse that lived next door to Joan in National City. And the Mellows family still owns that building. They're, so that's, when we first came, we started doing business at Horton Plaza, you'd walk down 6th Avenue in the morning and it was, people packing up produce trucks. And down at the bottom, in fact, the one that really is pretty amazing there is in this map in 1980. You talk about a early pioneer in this neighborhood. The spaghetti factory opened in that location in 1974. What were they thinking? That was 1974. That was crazy. Who would do that? So that's the beginning of the redevelopment era. And I'm going to now go backfill a little bit about how we got to be a part of downtown. We started after we got married. By the way, my wife and partner, Joan, say hello. And I want to, we were real partners in that business, but she was really operations, she kept that thing going. I ended up going out and getting involved in some of these community affairs, and the person that was holding down the fort and keeping the things running was Joan. So, people see my face often and think that it was my business. That's not true. She was the rock that kept it going. She was the one that had all the business skills. But we started in Pacific Beach in 1976. Actually, we had just $3,000 in wedding presents that we got from getting married in July of 76. In the fall of 76, we rented a space on Garnett Avenue. And it was, the original business was actually more of a, there we go. It had more to do with selling tickets. Our goal, in our first year in business, we figured we had to sell 300 seats to Europe to survive, and we sold 310, which was kind of kept going in our business. We just kept squeaking by year. Oh man. But it was an era when airlines were just beginning to get deregulated, and to get a cheap flight, prior to that, you had to be a member of some organization and get on a charter flight. And that's what I was selling at UCSD. You had to be a member of the university to get a cheap seat to Paris or Zurich. That opened up in the mid-'70s under Jimmy Carter. That's when deregulation really got going. And you began to have airlines like Sir Freddie Laker, the London innovator who was really the pioneer of low-cost international travel, started flying into LA. And there were a lot of travel agencies around, but most of them didn't know anything about this market. I'd been working with student travelers for years at UCSD and knew the folks that were running these flights and kind of knew the way that people thought. So we set out to be the supplier of tickets and your rail passes and student ID cards and hostel cards for people who are going backpacking in Europe. Over a period of time, you began to have the scheduled airlines get into the game. So TWA began to run a flight, specifically an L-1011, from San Diego to JFK Airport, New York, with a stop in St. Louis. So it was a direct flight, one-stop direct flight, same airplane. And wow, now from San Diego, all of a sudden, you were connected to the world. You could pick up, those flights to Paris, Madrid, London, Zurich, Istanbul. It was just what amounted to 2 stops. That was a big deal in the 80s, that San Diego was now that connected to the world that you could get on TWA and go all the way to Europe with one airline. So we began to develop the place that sold that type of travel, and we began to bring in some travel products. We were lucky in that a number of companies started, people didn't want to carry their father's luggage, their American Tourister or Samsonite. That generation wanted to go backpacking. They were taking backpacks, but they started, this one company, Dolt of California, began designing backpacks that were easy to carry when they're not on your back, which is what you have to do a lot of times when you're traveling like that. So that was perfect. You had some startup companies like JanSport and the North Face were just starting up in that era. And for us in spring of 1977, this young long-haired hippie came walking in and showed us some backpacks his wife had designed and sewed up. And we said, yeah, okay, we'll take a few of those. We worked with them for 35 years after that. That was Steve Barker. He and his wife Nona created the company called Eagle Creek, based in North County, San Diego. Their factory was actually up next to what is now the Belly Up Tavern in Solana Beach in that era. They ended up moving to San Marcos and then Carlsbad. Their production shifted off to Mexico under NAFTA in 1983, I think it was. That was interesting because I think this is a situation where people sort of often say, oh, those greedy companies moving those jobs overseas. Well, the problem was that their competition was doing that, and they were producing good products at a cheaper price. And you could have American made and have it cost $25 more, and people wouldn't buy it. The customer drove that era. That whole movement to making things overseas was really not company driven. That was customer driven because you're getting the good quality out of there. At any rate, we're selling travel accessories and some baggage at the store in PB. And we extended our business a little bit by going into the mail order business. The guidebook that everybody used in that era for travel in Europe was Let's Go Europe by Harvard student agencies. They had specific books on France and Spain and England. And we used to buy the inside front cover of that book. And we went to the great expense of getting a 800 number. And, you know, we were doing a pretty good business selling long before the internet with the mail order. We did mail order catalogs, have a couple of them on the back counter back there, you know, got pretty good at that. We used to take a trip every year to get a cover photograph. So here's Joan looking in a shop window. What you can't really see is this really cool picture. There's a pair of shoes just sitting there next to her. But so we'd go over, this is right around the corner from the Ritz Hotel in Paris. And not only did we get a cover shot, but we were able to write it off. It was a business expense, you know. We were going over and doing our own photography. And we even got our kids into the act. We took them to Australia in 1987, I think it was. So here we are out on the plains of Australia, you know, with stopping. Oh, look at that signpost. Oh, look at that polo. Can you stand here? Let's do that. So, but we got pretty good at the mail order business as well. And we did a lot of traveling. I mean, we were able to get free seats on a lot of airlines while we still had a travel agency. And, you know, felt you really got to test the product yourself. You know, you can't just sort of talk about it. You better be able to use it and tell a good story. So, you know, we did a lot of train travel. Again, took our kids to London. I love this one because we saw, Jesse and Kate saw a Derek Jacobi production of Hamlet in London at this age, starring a young actor that nobody had ever heard of, Kenneth Branagh. I mean, you know, but I think they kind of got hooked on theater in the process. So back to the kind of downtown San Diego and Horton Plaza story in particular. The redevelopment really got going when Pete Wilson became mayor in 1972. And the big project to get it started was the development of Horton Plaza done by the Hahn Company. Hahn had developed, by this time already, he developed Fashion Valley. He went on to develop UTC. Actually, that was 1977, so that was before Horton Plaza. But he had built quite a business of regional shopping centers, and Pete Wilson convinced him to do a shopping center in downtown San Diego to try to help revive the city. They borrowed some ideas from some developments on the East Coast. It wasn't going to be just your typical regional mall. There were these centers developed by the Rouse Company on the East Coast, Harbor Place, Baltimore, and Faneuil Hall in Boston, that were kind of more, you know, more of a lively experience. Go hang out, have dinner, more restaurants, music, carts. You know, not just selling in the stores, but selling out in the public space. And Horton Plaza brought in a lot of those ideas as they created Horton Plaza. Now, they also brought in department stores and movie theaters. So it was kind of a blend of this festival marketplace idea and the traditional shopping center. And we had taken a trip to Europe in the fall of 1984. And when we came back from that trip, a leasing agent from the Hahn Company had contacted us. And it was still the era of the shopping center, and we thought, well, you know, maybe we should try to develop a business model that we could replicate in that type of environment, in that shopping center environment. So we were interested in what they pitched to us, and we ended up signing a lease. We had a space in the corner by Robinson's. Here, you know, I'm looking at plans. We had about 3,000 square feet, and we developed a store and had an interesting experience at Horton Plaza. We got to know some people, like these folks that had a coffee shop upstairs and a restaurant across at Fifth Avenue. But you know, we still continuing with the backpack, travel clothing, travel accessories. We still had the travel agents when we were at Horton Plaza. let me go back to this one. When Horton Plaza opened, a lot of people may remember there was a great celebration, a big party on August 8th, 1985. It got a lot of attention, got a lot of national attention. New York Times wrote about it, and it was a big kind of breakthrough project. In fact, some of the thing they wanted to do it in the leasing program for Horton Plaza, they wanted a lot of local tenants. The goal was 40% locally owned businesses. They didn't want it just to be all the chain stores that you had at every other regional mall. This was what Festival Marketplaces did. They were largely local tenants. So you brought in like the Village Hat Shop here, which still is up in Hillcrest, the Heaven Pop Cuisine. Who else was Claudia's Cinnamon Buns, certain Croce's coffee shop up on the... No. Well, the coffee shop was Croce's at the beginning when it opened at Horton Plaza upstairs, not far from Claudia's Cinnamon Buns. A lot of people talk about how great it was. It was actually rather difficult in the beginning down there. Things didn't take off right away. This is 1988. We opened in 85, and we had no upstairs tenant, which was important. In fact, Croce's was just over here on the other side of the movie theater. And we were down in the corner. If at this level, you'd have to come around and get to our store over here. And there was people were not being drawn down there. So we've struggled. We had a hard time for the first few years at Horton Plaza. And in fact, the story that is not well known is that some of the restaurants that went in up the top of Horton Plaza really struggled. You had the folks that own the Harbor House put in a place called Grand Tour up on the restaurant row on the top level. And they were losing their shirts. And you had some guys out of Pacific Beach, Tom Hayes and Third Avenue Restaurant was the PB guys, the Halligans, Wayne Blackman, right, yeah. Yeah, and then the Harbor House. So those two guys had put in, they were told how great it was going to be. They put in expensive furnishings, and they were just losing their shirt. And this again, like Festival Marketplace, it was supposed to have restaurants that make you want to go hang out there. And the idea of Horton Plaza was you have restaurants up on top, and that brings people in. But it never really caught on. Ultimately, that was what was very successful is those restaurants went to the Gaslamp, and we'll tell you why in a minute here. But there was a big battle and lawsuits going back and forth that we had a little bit of a hand in. But we survived the Horton Plaza experience for 8.5 years, and as we were coming to the end of our lease, which would have been 1995. The movie theater upstairs was expanding, and they needed to drop an elevator shaft into the back of our building. So they were being real nice to us, and except that we had fought them on how the expenses had gone up, and so we weren't real popular back in the management office at Horton Plaza. But one of the things we pitched to the manager of Horton Plaza was down in the space that has been the Levi's stores for the longest time. We went into the center manager's office and said, why don't you let us do a really unique business down here? We'll do a combined travel store and a cafe for world travelers, a project between the travel store and Croce's. The center manager didn't bite on that one.
They'd be happy to have Croce's in there, but they weren't interested in
Yeah, they didn't want us. At any rate, in this era, here we go, yeah. So when we were at Horton Plaza, we had an office in the Keating Building for a number of years, and then over in the Louis Bank of Commerce building. So starting in 1988, we had offices in the Gaslamp, even as we had our store at Horton Plaza, and got to know people in this era. Armand Viora, come on, what a guy, huh? This was right around the corner from Croce's in that little outdoor covered area that's now a coffee shop. But Armand had been making keys in this location for 65 years. Some of that time was inside, a lot of it was outside, but you could go in and talk to, Joan kept running the business. I'd stand and talk to Armand for hours on end. He was an amazing guy. San Diego hardware was still going strong. And, again, you got to give credit to Spaghetti Factory for being foresighted. They really were ahead of the curve. But if anybody deserves credit for what happened in the Gaslamp Quarter, I think it's Ingrid Croce and Jim Rock, and Jim Croce too. When Horton Plaza opened, they went over and rented space in the Keating Building. What year was that? Was that 1985? In 85, okay, same year as Horton Plaza opened. And, at a time when people were afraid to go out on the streets of downtown, Croce's showed that you could do it. Now, the original restaurant was not Croce's. It was Blinchicki. The way I tell the story, correct me if I'm wrong, but you have Russian Jewish heritage, and Blinchickis are blintzes from that culture, right? And so that was the original restaurant, and you were struggling a little bit and decided to go ahead and change the name. The original one was Hillcrest. Okay. Oh, that's and that.
I remember being Blinchicki in Gaslamp for a while. They used to go in and buy big muffins from your sister.
At any rate, it was huge that Ingrid showed that it could be done over there. I mean, they did a great job and developed, the restaurant on the corner, the jazz club, the Top Hat Saloon. I mean, it became a series of businesses. And just planted a flag out there that, around which a whole lot of other people came in. In fact, some of the early ones, there was a whole bunch of Italians started.
That used to be a joke.
Yeah, it was like, how come you can have any kind of food you want as long as it's Italian, right? It was La Strada on the corner, then Panevino and Asti. So you had this whole section of Italian restaurants. And what was interesting to me, I mean, when we were in Pacific Beach thinking about moving to Horton Plaza, moving downtown, we were talking to customers who were traveling to Europe and loved big cities. And we thought to ourselves, gosh, I wonder if that whole redevelopment thing could work in downtown San Diego. Could it become more like one of those European cities? And that was our decision point, was we thought, wow, that would be cool if that worked. Let's go ahead and throw in our lot. We're going to take a chance on Horton Plaza. We moved down there. And the Italians also, took a chance on it and created their restaurants over on Fifth Avenue. So little by little, the neighborhood spread. You had a lot of art galleries in that time, which was great. They were some of the pioneers, and that was largely because the rent was cheap. But they created a fun atmosphere, and you had a really good vibe going there in the, say by the early 90s, there was something was really beginning to take off. You had, for example, the, what's the building called? What is it? No, this one. McGirt, yes. The McGirt building, where Ferris and Ferris had been down on the ground floor. And the Monroe Hotel was in there. And I don't remember the exact year, but this building was such a dump, the city acquired it, and they then sold it to Joe Zidens for $10. And he went ahead and spent $3 million fixing it up. I mean, it needed a lot of work. And he put his business in there, which was Z Gallery. Was a cool business. It was kind of a home furnishings, it wasn't really art gallery per se, but we were excited about it because it indicated that maybe the Gaslamp would develop as a shopping district. We were kind of concerned that is that going to happen? And in that era, what you have a lot of developers coming in. You have the old City Hall building, which in the 50s they put stucco on it. And this is the era when you had people like Leon Herrick and Kathy Anderson coming in and buying up buildings and fixing them up, including Old City Hall. They also did the Llewellyn building and a whole series of them, but they did it with tax credits. That was a big thing for developers. They could get tax credits. And one of the speakers a couple of months ago in the series was Marie Leah, who was involved in all of that and talked about how tax credits helped drive the neighborhood. And you would get a building refurbished, and then you'd get somebody else coming in, like Kathy and Jimmy DeMattea. Jimmy was a Top Gun pilot, and he was a trainer of Top Gun pilots. When Miramar Naval Air Station was still a Navy air station, he even went up and taught when they moved up to Fallon, Nevada. But this is just little by little you'd have stuff like this happen. Jimmy had been a partner in a restaurant in San Francisco called Johnny Loves, and came down to San Diego and created something similar, kind of a bar and grill called Jimmy Loves, and had the Top Gun theme in there, which was a very good idea for San Diego. And they went for 19 years and have given way to Florent now. And so as we're at Horton Plaza, we're looking, we're spending like, I remember Joan looking at the numbers, and we're giving Han Company like $11,000 a month for 3,000 square feet, and Joan says, why do we do that? And this real estate agent, yeah, we had a guy show us a building over here on 4th Avenue that was vacant at that time, had been refurbished, and we got the SBA loan, thank you taxpayers for underwriting us, to buy this building in 1994, and moved our business over here. And became deeply involved in the Gaslamp. Again, it was travel accessories, the books and maps in the back, luggage. We had gotten out of the travel agency business. We could see that airlines were going to be selling their product directly online. That business was going away. But we rented space to Student Travel Australia that had kind of a young clientele on a budget, and that helped bring traffic into our store. I was the book buyer, so I always loved the book business. In fact, one of the best-selling books, the Rick Steves books, the Rick Steves on KPBS. Well, Joan and I used to do seminars on how to travel on your own in Europe in Balboa Park. We used to rent the ballroom at Cafe Del Rey Mora, and we'd have 125 people come into our all-day workshop on how to travel on your own in Europe. Rick Steves ended up developing that whole idea. We didn't steal it from us. It was just a good idea. And he started doing books and then seminars and then TV shows. And then after we quit doing seminars, we used to underwrite his program here in San Diego. We had a big crowd. We did it several times. And one night was up at 4th and B, and we had about 1,000 people there for his event. And after the event, we said, hey, Rick, come on. You got to come down. Listen, you got to hear this guy. We went down to Croce's and listened to A.J. Croce play, and Rick Steves became a big fan of A.J. Croce that night. He really loved that. So, our business was travel clothing and luggage, and then we went online. One of the things we did was in 1997, we were very early online, just as the internet was beginning, and began selling products. Went through various iterations of a website, kept upgrading it every couple of years, adding products. And we had a great run online in 2000. Oops, lost it. Actually, this is a version of our last website. But what's going on here? There we go. We had a period around the year 2000, 2001 when we were doing 60% of our business online. I mean, it was, we really got it going. And had just a great staff. Dolly used to come in from UPS and get the bags from Ellen. We had a young woman from Russia, from Nizhny Tagil, working for us at that time. Just fabulous people. A couple of Bulgarians working for us. Again, Jesse in the back there was actually managing our website, even as he was at UCLA for many years. And Annette, oh my God, she was 83 when she left our employ, and she was like the best salesperson I've ever met in my life. And her amazing story was that she was living in Washington, D.C. during World War II. Her father was a naval officer, and they lived on a cul-de-sac, and the junior senator from Missouri moved in next door, and Annette became best friends with Margaret Truman. And Harry Truman was scheduled to come to her birthday party on April 12th, 1945. Annette, her birthday party, April 12th, 1945. He had to call it off. That was the day Franklin Roosevelt died. he became president. And when he finally went home that night, they did go over and have a ham sandwich at Annette's house. In fact, it was a story. But she was, oh my God, she had traveled with Margaret Truman and after the war, and it was just the most amazing person. At any rate, so that little story about the travel store. But now I want to kind of shift to talking about how did people start coming downtown? What were the things that drove traffic into downtown? What were the primary uses, as Jane Jacobs called it? And the one you really have to get a lot of credit for, now some of us had problems with this event, like you did and we did, but you got to admit, Streetscene was this most amazing thing. It started in 1984 with a couple of stages and built up year after year and became this huge music festival on the streets of downtown. It really worked back in an era when there weren't a lot of buildings. There were still a lot of parking lots, and they could put a stage out like this one. This was, I think this was 7th and Market. And with a big stage, you could have a big act. You could get maybe 8,000 people out in front of it. And they had, eventually we had Friday, Saturday night and the Sunday afternoon. And they had big acts. I mean, I remember who did we see? Chris Isaac, James Brown, Ray Charles, and Joan's favorite group, the Red Elvises. Did you ever see the Red Elvises? God, those guys were good. It was a Russian surf band. But, it was a phenomenal thing. Rob Hagee started it and ran it for a number of years. Well, ran it, eventually had to kind of move, the places in downtown were narrowed down to streets, and it really didn't work in downtown. He moved it out to Qualcomm Stadium for a while, and then moved it back to Petco Park for a year. But you really can't underestimate the importance of Streetscene, because it made people not only come downtown, you're out on these funky streets at night where you wouldn't go in the daytime normally, and people were excited about downtown. It created a great vibe. Now, it actually, if you were up north of Market Street and outside the venue, it kind of killed business for that weekend for a lot of us. But you got to give credit for that. There were a lot of events that helped create the brand of the Gaslamp. The Mardi Gras Shamrock, which is actually a fundraiser for the Gaslamp Quarter Historical Foundation. So there's a lot of street festivals that I think kind of created the Gaslamp. They brand it as a place to go and party. Sometimes it goes a little too far. It makes the Gaslamp feel like sort of a spring break destination. And that, as a retailer, or if you had fine dining, it wasn't the right vibe that was created by a lot of these street events. It brought a lot of people down. It's had its place, but it had a sort of a downside too. One of the people that used to do street events down here had an office upstairs above what's now Barley Mash, and she used to do mostly corporate events and was very involved in the Gaslamp Quarter Association. Catherine Stewart, who this is Mayor Faulkner's wife. So she was, one of the people. In fact, I think she was the chair of the Gaslamp Quarter Association the year after me. But she was involved. Here, in fact, this is a picture I think is taken on top of the Keating Building. So Streetscene events was one of the drivers of traffic that got people to come down here. The game changer, the big thing that made the Gaslamp become what it has become is the convention center. And it's under construction at this time. You see the sales aren't even up, so this is probably about 1988 or thereabouts. The Horton Grand Theater is already there. There's Old City Hall. But what the convention center did was it just brought waves of conventioneers and tourists in, staying at hotels. And the big thing was they'd be in meetings during the day, and after the meetings, you could walk up Fifth Avenue, and you just began to have one restaurant or another. It created customers, on a Monday night in February or a Wednesday night in October, when you won't have local people. A restaurant really can't depend just on local people. Most restaurants can't. I mean, there are a lot of neighborhood restaurants who can, but the kind of stuff that's developed here is highly dependent on as Jane Jacobs said, you have to have more than one primary use. So a primary use in this neighborhood became all of those people coming to do business at the San Diego Convention Center. Now, there's always a lot of talk about Comic-Con, the 130,000 people that come that weekend, and it's an incredibly fun event. I love it. It was never particularly good for our business. It was a kind of a geeky crowd that I loved, but not a high percentage of them were international travelers. Subway sandwich always did real good. Pizza by the slice places were just kicking it, and I hope it stays. I mean, it's been fun for us. A lot of times it was the medium-sized conventions. Maybe it's doctors or something. The big one for us, I don't know if it was for you guys. It was Esri. It's this. Geographical software convention that comes every year, brings people from all over the world. It's 6,000 or 7,000 people, but they're all travelers. So they're all out walking around and they're all wandering into our store and they loved it and they're buying stuff from us. So we did a lot more business with the 6,000 geographers than we ever did with 130,000 of these guys. But I do think, I like on the Convention Center's website, they make the point, come for the convention, stay for the vacation, which is something that if you're doing business out here, you really appreciate that the Convention Center is asking people to stay on. But they do. The reality is, I've heard people talk about it, people in our store. If you're coming out from Milwaukee or Washington, D.C., or you're flying in from Zurich, you're going to San Diego? Well, the spouse wants to come and maybe the kids want to come too. And a high percentage of people come and extend their stay. So the convention center is like the enormous draw. Leads people to stay into hotels. You get a lot of hotel development. And you have kind of a combination now of conventioneers, business travelers, and people just coming purely for fun, going to the zoo, going to the beaches as well. But that's a big part of what's happening in the Gaslamp. And of course, residential development, has just been booming in recent years. It started out down with the Marina District and has now spread into East Village. This was a project I particularly liked. I remember hearing that it was some developer out of Chicago that was doing this project. It's down near Kansas City Barbecue. And in fact, I used this little slice of land, kind of a triangular shaped land, when we first moved downtown to Horton Plaza. This was still Frost hardwood lumber. It was a lumber yard. Frost is still in business up on Miramar, but this was Frost hardwood lumber. And the Chicago developer came out and developed this property, and I liked it. And we, as it turns out, he had a brother back in Chicago who had a son who was living in San Francisco, who our daughter married. So Mike, turns out, I didn't know at the time, but Mike Crozier, who developed this project, still lives in La Jolla, is our son-in-law's uncle. So, but, the residential development, I don't know if probably you guys at Kansas City Barbecue probably do a lot more local residents in that location. You have a regular clientele that eats there, but you have the tourist convention here as well. So I found in our business the local residents weren't as big a factor. Office workers were bigger for us than the convention. Than the residential. And again, East Village, looking back toward the Gaslamp, it's just unbelievable to see what's happened in the last 10 years out there. The ballpark as a driver of people moving in. The Padres pitched the ballpark idea and passed the Prop C in 1998. And East Village, kind of looked like this. You had the San Diego Gas and Electric property out there. And in fact, Mike Morgan, who helped us buy our building, had this parcel right here, a full block parcel for sale for several years between, I think it's J and K, 8th and 9th Avenue. And he has signs up, and this is mid-90s, and just no interest. Nobody's interested. They're not interested in buying, and it's now center field at Petco Park. Again, if you were around in that era, it's like, wow. When we moved to the Gaslamp out of Horton Plaza, Joan and I were saying, gosh, I wonder if this what's happening down here, is it going to ever get beyond 8th Avenue? We thought 8th Avenue, that's it. That's like the boundary. Wouldn't it be great if that pushed out beyond 8th Avenue someday? And whoo, So the Padres came in. Actually, the other thing is this, This was a farmer's market down there. Did Tom Hom own the market, the building? I can't remember. I think he may have owned that building. But yeah, there was a farmer's market, produce market. You used to be able to go out there and get cheap tacos and things like that. And this is the land that the Padres acquired and decided to build a ballpark on. They snugged the ballpark up a lot closer to the Gaslamp than a lot of us expected. We sort of thought it was going to be a couple of blocks further east, and then they moved it right in. And for those of us that were down here at the time, we're thinking, "Whoa, what does that mean?" I mean, that's kind of cool that we're going to have a ballpark, but we also know there's going to be a parking problem. We already have a parking problem, and all of a sudden you're going to have Gaslamp restaurants patrons competing with people that are going to the ball game. How is this all going to blend together? Well, what was interesting with the Padres, and I'll talk a little bit about the community involvement later, but I was involved with the Gaslamp Quarter Association at this time and following the ballpark project, and we were invited out to the Padres offices to meet with Larry Lucchino, the president of the Padres. He was going to show us their designs, and we'd seen some stuff in the paper and it looked kind of cool. But we went out there, Steve Zipfel and Teresa McTighe and me, and we went out to the Padres offices, and it was like, wow, these guys, they were so far ahead of what they'd made public. It was unbelievable. They were really good. They were having meetings with the community. They really engaged the community and developed a project that really, really worked in downtown San Diego. Now, construction stopped for a couple of years. It was supposed to open in 2002. It took till 2004. But the ballpark is now anchors the south end of the Gaslamp along with the convention center, and it, I think it's generally a positive thing. It has certainly stimulated a lot more interest in sports bars. I mean, Bub's at the ballpark, Barley Mash. There's a business model to be had now. Blind Burrow. Lots and lots of kind of sports bar type places. But that's cool, I like that. In fact, over the next month, starting tomorrow, you really should spend some time in the mornings in the Gaslamp. Go to lunch in the Gaslamp over the next month. Tomorrow is the first game of the World Cup. And there are going to be, at lunch, it's being played in Russia, so it'll be, the last game of the day will be at lunchtime here. And boy, in prior World Cups, you want to find the bar that the Brazilian fans hang out at. Oh my God, it's great. The Mexican fans, when El Tri is playing, go to a Mexican restaurant. Go when Spain is playing, go to Cafe Sevilla. And in fact, a couple of months ago after one of these history talks, I was walking up Fifth Avenue, and I walked past Inca, the Peruvian restaurant on Fifth Avenue. And they were going mad. They had just won their qualifying game over New Zealand, and they were going to the World Cup, and there was this amazing party going on at Inca. And so Peru, go to Inca for that. So switching now a little bit, just to try to quickly go through a couple of the Gaslamp Quarter Association is kind of the business, the voice of the business community. When you're doing business in the Gaslamp, you have to pay a little extra on your business license every year to fund the Gaslamp Quarter Association. And you have these business associations in all the older neighborhoods in San Diego. East Village has one now. Little Italy's got a very powerful one. And this is kind of how the Gaslamp communicates with the city in many ways. They're officially recognized by the city and are kind of responsible for marketing the neighborhood. They create special events and things like that. One of the things they do is there's a land use committee that is now part of the Gaslamp Quarter Historic Foundation. I'm still on. And it's sort of where I remain involved downtown, but it's the way of trying to keep the neighborhood coherent and the historic fabric of the neighborhood, keep it from getting out of control. In fact, right now we've got an issue with the Chinese theater that's going in the old movie theater up at 5th and F Streets, 5th and G. They have a sign program that's over the top crazy. And the Gaslamp Land Use Committee has been working to dial that back, and it looks like we've succeeded. When I got involved through the Loop Committee, one of the things that Joan and I did, we had gotten our website up and running using a small team of women out in Little Italy to create our website. And we were the ones who took the lead to create the Gaslamp website. In fact, the gaslamp.com had already been taken by a guy at the Clarion Hotel, so we registered gaslamp.org and worked to develop what I think, this is the image of the Gaslamp that I always wanted to see. You know, it was pretty cool. Here was the listing from, I think this was 2000, of the restaurants. And it's fascinating. I won't go into it in that detail, and I don't think we're quite focused enough to see everything. There's Ole Madrid. I mean, what's fascinating to see is all of the restaurants that were around 18 years ago, and how few of them are around now. I mean, I think the reality of restaurant retail is that things are churning. I mean, it's always disappointing when somebody goes out. It's sad. But you know, if you had a nice long run, you know, you got to be proud of that. Gaslamp shopping, galleries, boutiques, and you know, unfortunately, as a retailer in the Gaslamp, I always felt that the sort of the bars were running the organization, and we went way over the top in marketing the neighborhood, sometimes unintentionally, but as a place to drink and party, and we could have done a better job at promoting shopping and fine dining. We did have a campaign one time that we developed as the retail committee. Was pretty cool, was a great idea, you know, kind of contrasting the stores down here, all the cool, unique, hard to find things that you could find down here in the more boutique level shops versus, you know, going to the big box stores or the shopping mall. A little bit about the redevelopment agency. You know, it really got going in the prior to the opening of Horton Plaza in the 1970s, and the first project areas were the Horton Plaza project area, the Marina District, and Columbia. That was all that they were tasked with overseeing. And in 1992, the areas expanded to all of downtown, and the redevelopment agency takes care of all land use functions in downtown, and this is a picture from their website from 2009, and it shows the active projects that the redevelopment agency was working on at that time. A lot of new construction, anything that required a permit basically went through Civic, CCDC, Center City Development Corporation. And they were, you know, I'm not going to talk about this too much because this is something that other people like Mike Stepner and others had a lot more experience with than I did, and it's a very interesting story, and I recommend it. Okay. The thing that I got involved with was the redevelopment agency made decisions on land use issues, but you had a community group that was parallel to them, made up of elected representatives from all the different neighborhoods. I was the Gaslamp business representative. And Jason Elrod, just really interesting people, architects and you know, attorneys and just activists and neighborhood people. There was kind of a blend of business owners and residents. And you have this throughout San Diego. Every community has a community planning group that advises, your advisory to, in most other areas, to the to the planning department on projects, and then to the city council. And in the case of downtown, in fact, Cindy, you're the Gaslamp business representative now, or are you back in Marina? So Cindy lives in the Marina, and she and Martin have the Kansas City barbecue down there as well. And she's really, like on the Chinese Theater, is really doing a lot of positive things for the Gaslamp. So the community groups got involved, and one of the projects that they worked on was the quiet zone, where the trains used to have to blast their horns going through. And I give David Priver a lot of credit, a Marina resident who was on when I was there. He was the guy that pushed that, got people to turn out at city council meetings. So the community group really has had an effect. And I think an awful lot of positive things happen. And a lot of it has to do with you have architects like Cindy who can look at the projects people are coming up and make positive recommendations. Cindy worked on the Thomas Jefferson Law School, the old police station, the headquarters, You know, so has a lot of experience as an architect downtown, but also really overseeing a lot of projects. We operate with a community plan that was developed in 2006. When I was on the community planning group for 10 years and chaired it for 3 years. And as chair, one of the things I got interested in was, you know, the chapter 7 was about the street types in downtown. And this was along about 2010 when building had stopped. You know, the recession hit in 2008. You just didn't have any design review to do. And, you know, there were a lot of people living in downtown by this point, and there was some revenue flowing to the redevelopment agency. And I looked at this map, and, you know, it's got, you know, the main thoroughfares marked out and the sort of neighborhood retail districts. But it also has these blue lines that are supposed to be bike lanes. And the city wasn't doing anything about that. So we pushed hard to get the city moving on that, and they developed a mobility plan, which hopefully it's long overdue. But hopefully you'll begin to see it implemented pretty soon, and there will be separated bike lanes, and downtown really should be a great place to bicycle. The thing I really got involved with was parking, because it was real important to the travel store. We needed to draw people from La Jolla, Encinitas, Ensenada, La Mesa. You know, we needed people to drive down, and so I cared a lot about parking. In the early days, there were a lot of parking lots, like south of, I mean, this was the Clarion Hotel at the time. It's now the Gaslamp Marriott. And, you know, south end of the Gaslamp, you could park $1 all day or $2 all day. But what happened in 1997 was that Councilman Ware and Kehoe came up with a proposal to have 45% of the money that goes into parking meters come back to the community and be spent by that community to make things better. This was when that movie theater was being constructed up there on Fifth Avenue by Oliver McMillan with no parking. So I think that was a driver of this initial idea to have revenue flow back to the district. That passed, and we then went into, developed a comprehensive parking program, of which I was a member of the committee. Coming out of that, we identified the areas of highest impact, and a parcel was acquired by the city up at 6th and Market and developed as the Park on Market. And then the big parking structure down next to the ballpark, this actually predates the ballpark when this property was acquired. The city built a parking structure down there. And that all grew out of this comprehensive parking program that was driven by the community. Another thing that happened was in 2003, the city manager decided that they needed more revenue, so they just were going to raise parking rates. The problem for downtown is that 80% of all parking meters in San Diego are in downtown. And so for a street level business trying to compete with, you know, REI in Kearny Mesa or Adventure 16 in Mission Valley or, you know, El Portal Luggage at Fashion Valley, you know, you can go there and park for free. And my customers are now, you know, already have to pay, and you're going to raise it. The proposal wasn't that you would put in new meters in La Jolla and Mission Beach. It was just raise rates on existing meters. And I kind of hit the fan on that one and went out and did my own little study. I went into the Marina District, drew a map, identified how many meters on each block face, north, west, east, south, you know, came up with a chart block by block of how many meters there were. And I came up with a total of, 401 meters. And then I looked at them over the course of an afternoon and counted how many of them actually had cars in them. And what I discovered confirmed my suspicion, and that is that they were 59% vacant. Here's the city manager wants to raise parking rates. And you know what? They're hardly utilized. The problem is not, you know, if you want to raise revenue, what you ought to do is get people using those parking meters. So I challenged the city manager in a budget hearing and said, you know, that's dumb. There's a better way. Let's figure out how to get people using the meters more. And the city manager's task force was created that I served on. And for a year we looked at, and we had members from Old Town, La Jolla, Pacific Beach, all over town that have parking impacts. And we rewrote the council policy on parking, and it gave flexibility back to the neighborhoods. So that downtown became parking district number 1, and a downtown parking management group was formed that I served on for many years, and Cindy is now on. And we really had a great relationship with the city. The city realized that, yeah, you know, those meters ought to be occupied by people. Let's figure out, you know, let's get it into balance. Let's figure out what the right pricing, how long should you be able to stay. And everything at that point was, you know, the compromise that was made by Councilman Zucchett was we're going to go $1.25 an hour, 2 hours, but the neighborhood can now look at that and figure out what's better for you. So what we came up with in downtown is, you know, it's hardly anybody's parking in East Village, and we put in 9-hour, 50-cent an hour meters. A little closer in East Village to the Gaslamp, we put in 4-hour, $1 an hour meters. We left the Gaslamp at 2 hours, $1.25 an hour. And we, you know, so we extended the time you could stay and lowered the rate in certain areas. And son of a gun, you know what happened? The revenue went up to the city. They were making more money by charging less and having higher utilization, and it fed customers into the neighborhood, which ought to be done. In fact, the other thing I did was this, you know, we have these shifted hours in this area between 1st and 7th Avenue. It was something I pushed for, did my own little drawing to pitch the idea. And so we moved the hours back. It used to be 8 to 6, but you know, nobody's parking in this neighborhood. There's no demand in this neighborhood in the morning. It's overwhelming demand in the evening. So let's don't extend the hours. Let's just push it back to when you actually need, when there's a demand for parking. And that's what we did with the Downtown Parking Management Group. Clean and Safe was, I won't go into detail, but Joan actually helped get that passed back in 2000. And the city does a very limited amount of services. And if we didn't, you know, what we paid on our building on 4th Avenue was an extra $3,300 a year that went into the Clean and Safe Fund. All of the property taxes in downtown, all the buildings paid into this fund, and it creates the supplemental security and maintenance service. And we'd really be screwed if we didn't have that. I mean, you can complain about it, but it's pretty essential. A little more about retail, the thing I'm most familiar with. Some people call what's going now retail apocalypse. You know, the big shift now is instead of buying stuff in stores, people are buying online. We did really well online ourselves, so we don't have any right to complain. But you now have you know, stores closing like crazy, including Horton Plaza. I think you know, Horton Plaza is kind of is on the market now. But you have like some centers have converted. College Grove has converted to more of a big box center. So these malls, in order to survive, they're adapting to the new times. In the Gaslamp, the question really is street retail. What kind of street retail works? And there are some places that are quite good. Gorin Brothers, I think, really matches up nicely with the neighborhood. And you still have some like Quicksilver, Urban Outfitters. But I think for the future of the Gaslamp, you know, what's the neighborhood going to look like as retail kind of disappears? You have a lot of buildings, a lot of commercial real estate, a lot of it's out there sitting empty. And in earlier times, this would be a shopping district. You've had galleries and clothing stores and shoe stores, but it's one of the big problems for the Gaslamp right now is it's suffering from this national trend that everybody, including me, is buying stuff online. So where does that take us? Amazon, of course, has come along as the big demon here, but they were particularly nasty back in 2011. At Christmas time, in our store, this guy comes in and does what Amazon has asked him to do. It's called showrooming. Amazon sent out did big advertising, sent out a message to their customers, told them to go into your local store, take your smartphone, download the Amazon app, go in there and do a snapshot of the barcode on the product, and right there in the store, Amazon will kick up, you know, a price often cheaper than what you're paying in the store, and they'll give you $5 credit off of that purchase. You know, so customers were going in, getting the product demonstrated, looking at it, handling it, deciding what they wanted to buy. And this guy in our store, was doing that. We had a lot of that going on. So for a retailer, that's a pretty deadly thing. And in fact, after reinventing our business year after year, constantly trying to figure out what's going to work next year, we had to throw in the towel back in 2013. We fortunately had bought that building back in 1994, and it went way up in value. So we were able to retire on the real estate purchase. So we ended up in good shape. But the funny thing is, we had a lot of old customers come in and say, "Oh man, I'm sorry to see you go. Okay, what's on sale?" And that was cool. We had a great run. I'm pleased with that. Talking about, just to finish here, the future of the gas lamp. What does the future hold for the gas lamp? One of the things to bear in mind is that with current transportation systems, we are now connected in a way that we weren't not all that many years ago. Before TWA came here, we were really still off in a corner. This is a snapshot of FlightAware. I don't know if you know this website. It's fantastic. But this is a little screen capture from a couple of days ago showing all of the planes en route to San Diego at that moment. They're coming out of Houston, Dallas, JFK, Boston, London, Zurich, a whole bunch of planes going in to land down here. So one of the things that San Diego has going for it, and the gas lamp in particular, is there's a lot of people traveling, and a lot of people want to come to San Diego. So that's going to underwrite business for a lot of people. One of the big issues that still remains is what happens to Horton Plaza, where that helped get downtown started. It's now very much a drag, and it's hard to tell what's going to happen. It's pretty clear that some new developer is going to come along and buy that property. It's great location. Hard to tell how much of it they'll keep and how much they'll tear down, but there's going to be a big project there. I mean, a best case scenario in my mind is it would be like some big company would create a campus or an office headquarters there, because what we really need in downtown is more employment. That's what the gas lamp need, is more people working down here, going out to lunch out here in the daytime. So downtown, there's still parking issues in downtown. That's sort of you hear it from your customers. Fortunately, Lyft, Uber, people come down. There's a new way to get down here. There may be self-driving cars coming soon. So the future of the neighborhood is still sort of in question. But I must say, if you were here like we were before Horton Plaza, and you knew the neighborhood from that area, and you see what it is now, it's a pretty darn good start. And it was done by a lot of people. There were a lot of hands involved in this happening. And Joan and I feel proud to have been part of it, and pleased to have gotten to know so many people in the neighborhood, so many customers, so many amazing staff members. So, exuberant diversity.
All right.
Are there any questions for them? Well, I want to thank you all for coming, and encourage you all to become members of the foundation if you're not. If you paid $5 today, see Jamie in the back, and she can help you turn that into a year-long membership with us. One of the great perks is these monthly lectures. The new lecture brochure is here. Make sure you pick it up. Unfortunately, during a misprint at the printers,